everyone. Welcome back to the Coach and Benway podcast. I am Dr. Benway. Around this neighborhood somewhere in his old ways is Coach. Sorry, I gotta put you down a little bit. But, this is gonna be a fun episode.
People keep calling me boomer. I'm not a baby boomer. I'm a fucking Gen Xer, man. Come on. I didn't protest the war in Vietnam. Ha ha.
I know, but it's a gift, Coach. Yeah, you think that people than you are, but this is kind of fun because I remember this. So, to just introduce this, we're going to be talking about the Vietnam War situation. I know, a very small topic, but we did it by way of me recommending to you the Ken Burns 18-hour documentary, admittedly one of his lighter ones, of this war. And I said to you, it's like, look, this may come across as odd, but I really think you're going to take to it. And I was surprised that you really latched onto it as well as we were watching it. Yeah, I was kind of interested in having you kind of just talk about that experience.
Yeah, because from my point of view, I thought that the documentary did a lot of things really, really well. And one of the things that it did really well was in humanizing the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, and also delineating the difference between the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. I really loved the footage that he used that was taken by the North Vietnamese and by the Viet Cong, because I thought that footage added a terrific counterpoint to the American footage, because the American footage is in color and it has that typical grainy look of 1960s footage, whereas the North Vietnamese footage is black and white, very poor quality.
It looks like World War II.
Yeah.
I literally thought it was like World War II footage, just popped up out of nowhere.
Yeah, very much so. And I thought it was very even-handed and very... Look, if you're going to do an 18-hour documentary and it's fairly serious, you're going to go into a lot of nooks and crannies that most people have never gone into. And I think that the show in and of itself overall was terrific. It was a terrific way to learn and digest a lot of information about the war. I thought on a technical level, it was great. I thought it was just definitely worth watching. However, Jesus fucking Christ, these guys... Okay, Ken Burns, well, we both know that he's a Democrat. He's a big Democratic contributor. And it was really surprising, on the one hand, that he admitted to some of the things that John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson had done. But he admitted to it very lightly, And for instance, some of the things that he never admitted to was the outright lying over the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which was... It was, if not a false flag, it was very disingenuous. The people, the Gulf and Tonkin resolution, they knew that it wasn't as clear-cut as they painted it, and it was basically a lie. And the other thing, too, is that Ken Burns fessed up to the fact that John Kennedy authorized the assassination of a foreign head of state. He tried to pretend that this, that, and the other, but in the end, he had to say it because it's true. Because John Kennedy did this, Well,
it's more than just saying, it's true. He actually used identity. I think it's his private communication, or he was talking to someone, I don't know, where he said, this happened. We kind of authorized it. We let it happen. I had my reservations. It happened under my watch. It's my responsibility. Because the reason that caught my attention is because I have known for years that the Kennedy fans have denied his involvement in that assassination for a long time. There's even this is when I was really big on listening to Christopher Hitchens, and this was a little documentary that came out after JFK, the Oliver Stone movie, and it was all about arguing, was JFK a good guy, bad guy, whatever. And the subject of what he was going to do with Vietnam came up. And Hitchens said, look, Oliver Stone's notion that JFK was secretly going to really end the war was bullshit. In fact, he was his hands were bloodied with the assassination of the, Chiu, I think, was president at the time. And Ziem?
Yeah, I forget. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
They all sound fucking the same. I'm sorry, people. It's true. But needless to say, Kennedy's, I think, press secretary was there, or someone in the press office, and said, that's a bald-faced lie. It's never been proven, this, that, and other, and this, that. They're really adamant saying it didn't happen. Well, this documentary has Kennedy himself saying it fucking happened, and he was responsible.
Yeah, and he's saying he regretted it. Big fucking deal that he regretted it. And he basically tries to excuse away, he was on vacation. He wasn't paying that much attention. He didn't realize the implications of what he was ordering. Bullshit. Okay? Bullshit. If he didn't understand the responsibilities, then the guy was an incompetent. Okay, which do you prefer? Him to be an incompetent, or him to be, a man with blood on his hands? Oh, okay. Look, I could care less because I don't look at John Kennedy as a fucking saint. On the contrary, I look at the guy as a rapist because that girl who came out a few years ago. What did she basically say? That she was raped and used, and Jesus Christ, it was just disgusting the way that those people used this poor 19-year-old girl, the 19-year-old intern, right? He was a rapist. He was a murderer because he had this man assassinated just because it was politically convenient. He's just a horrible, horrible individual, okay? And the St. Jack thing, fuck that noise, right?
And I think the assassination happened a few months before his own assassination.
Yeah, karma. And karma at work, motherfucker. Yeah.
Well, and the assassinated president's Vietnam's wife said of the situation, well, now Jackie knows how I fucking feel. Like, that was her response.
Yeah. But anyway, the thing also that really bothers me about it, I mean, disproportionate, was how Ken Burns treated Nixon. Because, the Nixon, look, I have it here in my notes, for example, one of the things that ticked me off, the My Lai massacre, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, My Lai, whatever.
I think My Lai is how they pronounce it in the doc.
The My Lai massacre happened in March of 1968. Now, that is a full, 8 months before the 68 election that put Richard Nixon as president. A full, almost a year, 10 months, 12 months, before he assumed office, okay?
Right.
Nixon had nothing to do with My Lai. Nothing whatsoever to do with it. And yet they juxtapose that massacre. They stick it in the Nixon episode, when Nixon is in power, and it gives you the illusion that this happened under Nixon. It happened under Johnson. It happened right after the Tet Offensive. And there's just a lot of manipulation, very subtle manipulation, editorial manipulation, to make Nixon the evil bad guy, when the very record in the fucking thing shows that Nixon was trying to end the war as quickly as possible. He was trying to bring back the troops as quickly as humanly possible and negotiate an exit as quickly as humanly possible. And the thing is, see, in 3 years, or what was it, before the 72 election, they went from 550,000 troops that Johnson had as of November 1968, all the way to something like 60,000 troops by the time of the 72 election. Okay, that kind of drawdown of over 500,000 troops in 4 years is unbelievable. And the fact of the matter is, it's a minor miracle that drawdown did not create a military vacuum that the North Vietnamese could have just driven a tank through. Okay, so that withdrawal was as quick as they possibly could have, given the circumstances. Because they Ken Burns shits all over Nixon from the very beginning. I mean, it was laughable if it hadn't been so shocking the way he was just relentlessly trying to shit on him. And
I'll be the tempered voice here. I was actually I told you this before we started recording. I was actually kind of shocked that it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be on Nixon. So Ken Burns can't hide the fact that Nixon's plan from literally day one of the administration was to end American involvement in the war. Yeah. And I think there's a couple of things that Ken Burns really wants to jag up Nixon's ass, which you can't entirely deny Nixon's involvement, but you can question the interpretation. One, without the My Lai stuff. Yes, the My Lai massacre happened outside of his administration, completely alien from him. Nixon, however, did reduce the sentence and tried to pardon the commanding officer responsible for it. Now, my interpretation of that is it's almost like the Breaker Morant situation in the Boer War. It's like you're gonna start throwing some guys under the bus there. It's like giving speeding tickets at the Indy 500.
Yeah, the line from Apocalypse Now.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's absurd to even play that game, especially because Ken Burns was fair to the guys. He said, "Look, before that massacre happened, these guys were losing people left, right, and center in that area. One of the preferred platoon commanders or favored platoon commanders had just got killed days before. This was a group of people ready to snap." Yeah. And they fucking snapped. And they were put in a position so that they would snap. So it was kind of fucked up to start.
Okay, but hang on, I'm thinking about what we're talking about. We're all over the fucking place, okay? So let's just step back a little. Okay, let's talk about the macro of this documentary, and then we can move on to other stuff that I'm interested in talking about. But like on a macro level, okay, what I liked about this documentary very much was that it talked so much about the North Vietnamese experience before the Americans arrived. Because to tell you the truth, my notion of the French involvement had been hazy at best. And I didn't recognize, I hadn't really thought about the fact that it was just the French trying to hold on to their former colonies, and that was the war. And I did not quite understand the significance of Dien Bien Phu, which was the big battle where the French were decimated by the communist Vietnamese. And it was really interesting. What was really interesting, too, was to understand the internal dynamics of it. Because, like, for instance, I didn't understand anything about Ho Chi Minh and Le Duan. Le Duan was the first secretary of the Communist Party, who eventually wound up shoving aside Ho Chi Minh, who was like the hero. He was Uncle Ho. This aesthetic, ascetic rather. Is it ascetic? Somebody
Aesthetic.
Ascetic, yeah. Man who never married. Presumably, he seems to have been like celibate and never, not like Gandhi celibacy, which was like a sham, but like, because, Gandhi was a pedophile, right?
Yeah.
I
hear stories.
It's more than just stories. It's like known that he was a pedophile, like the kind of pedophile like Mao. But anyway, he was really celibate. He didn't have any possessions. He grew his beard long so that he would look older. And he wanted deliberately and self-consciously to be the leader of the country. But what's interesting is that Le Duan wanted power. And he wound up getting the power and prosecuting the war. And what's really interesting to me from the documentary is that the North Vietnamese didn't have to fight the war. It was, in a very real sense, you could feel as if the Americans and the South Vietnamese were reacting to North Vietnamese aggression. If they'd simply piped down, the Americans would have eventually lost interest and left. The only reason the Americans kept upping the troops was because the North Vietnamese kept throwing soldiers at them. And that is something really interesting. I didn't realize that in a very real sense, the South Vietnamese and the Americans were fighting a defensive war. It's something that I had not really. First of all, I hadn't really known it. Go ahead.
Right. Well, that's partly to tie it back to Nixon, and that is partly why people kept throwing shit at Nixon. Is for a long part of the war, like part of the way it was prosecuted, is that there really weren't invasions in an aggressive kind of way into the North to say, the North will become like the South. It was, to your point, yeah, the South is going to do its own thing. What they tried to throw against Nixon is, and it's funny because Johnson did the same thing, was to say on occasion when the North Vietnamese started getting really aggressive, that they would start bombing Hanoi and the North as a means of controlling them. It wasn't for conquest or to just, really just completely shatter the North. It was to say, stop going fucking crazy or we'll punish you for it.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a different way of fighting the war. It's funny because this is going into the question of what was the nature of this war, right? Was it a sort of Cold War defensiveness? Was it an imperialist war? All of the above? That's kind of the question we're kind of circling around on this front.
Exactly right.
Because multiple players, this isn't just an American war and people are responding to Americanism. It's a much older point, and like even Ken Burns' documentary, I think starts at the very latest. I'm sorry, at the very around like World War II, definitely, maybe even earlier. Certainly referencing earlier than World War II.
What the Vietnamese conflict? Oh yeah, it's been going on since forever. Okay, look. The bottom line, it was a war of Vietnamese independence, and what was able to happen was that the North Vietnamese were able to achieve independence from the French by allying themselves with China and the Soviet Union. The South held on to its precarious independence from the North, which is simply stronger. It had the political will in a way that the South did not. They allied themselves first with the French and then eventually with the Americans, and they just didn't have the will, political will, spiritual will, whatever you want to call it, to hold on to their independence.
There was an artificiality about the South that you couldn't really say existed in the North. The North was, to your point, really a product of that revolutionary moment.
Yeah.
The South was almost a construct of America saying, we don't want this to be a fully communist situation here for external reasons, Plus, there's probably a certain degree of them not wanting to offend the French too much.
Yeah.
But needless to say, there was this precariousness about the South, which isn't to say that the South Vietnamese were fake anti-communist or
Well,
they
also,
were.
there's something else that we have to understand is that the North Vietnamese became unified under the Viet Minh, which was the Vietnamese Communist Party. And the Vietnamese were fucking evil motherfuckers. I mean, they were evil. They were as hard-ass, badass motherfuckers as you can find anywhere. They executed their political opponents. They had no problem, carrying out assassinations against people who were competing with them for power in North Vietnam. That's how they consolidated their power, just like every communist regime has always done. They always wind up turning to violence against their political peers in order to be the only ball player on the field. And then they wind up squaring off against the coalition of all the people who are against them. This has always happened with communists. They always wind up doing the exact same thing. They wipe out everybody around them because they are disciplined, they are true believers. And they wipe out everybody around them, either wipe them out or get them to play ball with them. And then they wind up facing the biggest, toughest son of a bitch that they wind up finding. And often as not, it's the capitalists. It's the people who don't want to live under communism because they know what communism is. And in this case, it was the South Vietnamese and the North Vietnamese over all this relentless time, after World War II. I mean, the Japanese, these guys have been fighting the Japanese. Then they were fighting the French. And they were fighting each other and finally, becoming a unified force. Who do you think winds up leading such a communist party? Goddamn hard sons of bitches. And these guys were tough, okay? And ruthless. And they were willing to sacrifice the flower of their country to win, Oh, man, that's horrible. I mean, I look at it and I'm just horrified by the whole situation.
Well, what's also interesting when you watch it, there's a couple of things there. One, the documentary is not shied away from talking about whether they're victims or opponents of the North Vietnamese in the South. So some people they talk to are refugees from the North to the South and eventually out of the country. Others are the South Vietnamese Army and Marine gentlemen. And, so you're right that they don't point out, or they don't fail to point out the North was fucking crazy. But the other thing they also point out, which was really compelling to me, is that a lot of the North Vietnamese soldiers they interview, a lot of them aren't really motivated by communist true believerism.
Oh, no.
At least the ones they interviewed. A lot of them were just basically, it's nationalism primarily. And more the sense that don't tell us what to do.
Yeah, it points to the fact that the communists were so agile in appropriating nationalism for their cause, because they confused the issue of communism and nationalism, and that was very effective because it made all of the people in the North say we want to unify the South because they're basically the puppets. They kept referring to the puppet army. Remember when they're talking about the South Vietnamese army? They kept talking the puppet army because they did not look at anybody in the South as independent. And they viewed the Americans as the puppeteers, not as the allies. Yeah.
Exactly, and that's a product. Not to say that the Soviet, political influence had no sway over this, but that's definitely a Maoist third worldism in the kind of world in the lexiconography and historiography of communism. These differences mean something to some people, but that this is why people say Maoism is basically fascism with a communist face, because they really did play up the nationalist game very hard, and certainly the Maoist tradition plays into that, and a lot of the Southeast Asian communist regimes had elements of that. What's interesting in Vietnam is you can hear it totally, which is why they just are very comfortable with the nationalism and saying, "Oh, it's the anti-colonialist approach." But what's funny is Ho was more of a Soviet guy, not a Maoist guy. In fact, the Vietnamese hate the Chinese. You'll even learn after and this is what was also great about it. I knew this already, but I was just happy to see it in the documentary. After the war, with the Americans leaving, not only did the Vietnamese fight the South and win, they invaded Cambodia because the Cambodians, after the Khmer Rouge regime, were going really fucking crazy. So the Vietnamese conquered Cambodia and then had their own little mini Vietnam War.
Yeah.
And then the Chinese invaded North Vietnam to punish them for the invasion of Cambodia until the Vietnamese repulsed the Chinese back.
Yeah.
So they had fought almost everybody at that point. by the mid 80s, I think every major player you could think of in that area was fought by the Vietnam.
Yeah, the Vietnamese are tough little brown people. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if I'm in a foxhole, I want one of those little brown people, the Vietnamese ones, not the other ones, because the other ones are just like all about pleasure and sex and drugs and what have you. Vietnamese, they're tough little motherfuckers. Unsurprising that the Vietnamese population in the United States has advanced the way it has. They are tough, tough people. They don't screw around. And so anyway, the thing that I was fascinated by was the realization that the North didn't actually have to fight with the Americans. It was a war of choice on the part of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. Viet Cong, as you may or may not know, was the basically the communist guerrilla in South Vietnam, which was not. It was allied with the North Vietnamese army, but they weren't really always on the same page, basically. I mean, clearly there was a separate political leadership. And I wish that the documentary had gone into a little bit of who was actually leading the Viet Cong and talked a little bit more about that, the internal organization of the Viet Cong. But be that as it may, what was interesting to me was that the North Vietnamese, it was a war of aggression on the part of the North Vietnamese. They were trying to conquer the South. And it was truly a defensive war. So in the question which we were circling before, what kind of war was this? One could honestly say that it was a defensive war to defend a very fragile and unstable democracy in South Vietnam from a clearly territorially expansionist regime in North Vietnam. That is how you should look at it. Also, I think it was a proxy war between the United States and China and the Soviet Union. China and the Soviet Union, of course, arming North Vietnam. And also, here is the thing that I find most interesting, is that the war in Vietnam showed that John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson were horrible geopolitical thinkers. They did not understand the world stage or how the world works. And that is really surprising because Nixon understood it. Because Nixon played the game, you know. He played the game on a big stage because he's saying, I'm a big player. I'm a big guy. I'm the United States of America. I got thousands of nuclear missiles and submarines and aircraft carriers and shit like that. Am I going to mess around with a pissant little shithole country? Or am I going to go and sit with the big boys and figure out a way that we can get along? And that's what he did. He went and opened China. He went and talked to the Soviet Union, right? He mined the Gulf of Tonkin, right? Like 2 weeks before he was going to go and meet the Soviets. And the Soviets were like, oh, this is uncalled for, blah, blah, blah. And he shows up and they're like smiles, you know? And he knew he was a better card player. He was a much better geopolitical thinker and strategist than Johnson and Kennedy. Also, you can say that it was Kissinger. It doesn't really matter because at the end of the day, it's the leader. And the leader picks his people. If you want to say that Kissinger did it, fine. But it meant that Nixon picked him. Nixon picked this obscure professor in fucking Harvard to lead his foreign policy effectively. So it doesn't give a shit. You
also can't forget the main thing, that Nixon was in a better position to do this than the liberal end of the government, even though Kennedy and Johnson were clearly
only Nixon could go to China.
Only Nixon could go to China. Nixon's anti-communist bona fides were much older and much stronger than either of those two guys, even though when it came to anti-communism, to be perfectly honest, Kennedy and Johnson weren't really pussyfooting around. Oh, no. They weren't McGovern. They were not McGovern. Don't ever think otherwise. And that's one of the things I want to poke my Oliver Stone's eyes out a little bit to say, don't make Kennedy a fucking hero for you.
Yeah, he wasn't McGovern and he wasn't McCarthy, for crying out loud. Jesus.
And that's what was so compelling, but when you have Nixon into this picture, it's like Nixon, and we had talked about this, like day one, Nixon knew this was a war you got to stop. Yeah. And I'm going to stop it. Before the election, too, mind you. And regardless of his motives, it doesn't really matter. He really did pull soldiers out. He actually reduced or got rid of some of the obvious corruption and inequities in the old lottery system, and just did something a little bit more objectively. You can't be richer and get your way out of this. It's just going by sort of date of birth.
No, he created the lottery. It hadn't existed before him.
Well, they had some. It was a draft, but he created a more random system. In
Yeah,
other words,
exactly.
a more equitable system.
Yeah, exactly.
So we had that, and the other good thing, what you had just mentioned, the two biggest supporters of North Vietnam were the Soviet Union and China, and not in a fake way. They were really giving arms and equipment to the point where the North Vietnamese said he's getting friendly with our supporters. They were afraid of getting fucked,
Yeah.
and it was even to the point where it was like at the negotiating table. And this is what's so compelling to me. I mentioned this to you as well. Because this was the thing people in America always threw against Nixon, was that his peace with honor bullshit was like, he's just keeping the war going and getting more people killed. So, while he pretends to be ending the war, it's like, no, he really was. He was trying to end the war without embarrassment is the way to understand it. And he succeeded in this so well that there was a point in the negotiations where the North Vietnamese were like, oh, they were pissy and they wanted to, keep, going, basically stalling the situation. And Zhou Enlai from China said, look, you fucking idiots, let them go. They're wanting to go. Just wait. You can get back at this South Vietnamese whenever you want. Let Nixon have a way of leaving without embarrassment, because if you continue to embarrassment, he ain't gonna fucking leave. And they wanted him to go. Everybody was okay with this, except the North were getting a little pissy.
Yeah, and the thing is, see, the Asians all, with the whole thing about face and preventing embarrassments being such a high value in their culture. Yeah, the North Vietnamese didn't seem to understand this about the Americans, that they had face too. And it's understandable because the Americans also didn't want to abandon so quickly that it created a military vacuum where the North Vietnamese could simply run over the country. They wanted to be able to arm the South Vietnamese. As the documentary points out, at one point in time, the South Vietnamese army was the 5th largest in the planet. And that's remarkable, think about it. Okay, because there's the American, the Chinese army, the Soviet army, then the UK and Germany. They were bigger than the German army, probably. Jesus Christ!
Oh, right? Absolutely, and that was and it was funny how people were noting, it's like, Americans, if the Americans in those last years of the war had given that amount of material to the North, they said the North would have been able to continue the fight for 100 years. Yeah, that's how much they were investing in it. And to be fair, they knew that the South Army isn't going to cut it. There's too much corruption. Yeah. There's less resolve to win. But look, it's again face saving. It's like this is the price to get out. And this is what was so compelling about the documentary to me. It made clear that the anti-war or the anti-Nixon camp really didn't know what the fuck it wanted to do. It had no consistent position other than, look, we want American soldiers out. And we're like, okay. Nixon says, here's the cost of how you get that out. And without making a complete fucking disaster. And they didn't kind of care. You'd have some people said, out now immediately, to hell with this, that, and the other. And others just failed to realize, look, you pull out like willy-nilly and not give a shit, the South is going to collapse like nobody's fucking business, which frankly is what happened after Nixon left. And you're going to have a situation where, to the average eye, you're going to say, okay, the South is collapsing and Cambodia has gone to the Khmer Rouge. Maybe the fucking domino theory is right, because it's fucking happening very fast. Yeah. And Nixon knew you had to create a situation to ameliorate that. Yeah. And that's partly why the détente situation in both Soviet Union and China happened, in order to prevent that fear that, like, look, shit, they're really winning everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, look, my thinking is that the documentary in and of itself shows that Nixon was doing everything in his power to get out of the war as quickly as possible. Just the numbers speak for themselves. Withdrawing 500,000 troops in 4 years. It was a remarkable achievement. Now, the thing is, the documentary, I really despise their treatment of Nixon, because the first time the My Lai thing comes up, you know what they quote Nixon as saying, that My Lai was all the fault of New York Jews. Okay. Yeah, that's the first thing that they talk about. Okay. Nixon said that he thought that the Soviets and the Chinese were behind, the Soviets principally were behind the anti-war protest. Johnson thought the exact same fucking thing. Okay. He thought it was all a communist plot. He didn't believe that it was like an actual, a grassroots movement. J.
Edgar Hoover operated under the baseline assumption that was the case. Who do you think was informing both presidents?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Now, here's the other thing that the documentary, it barely glanced at this in a single interview with some guy named Zimmerman. who was anti-war, of course. But it was Zimmerman who said that in the first protest, like 10 people showed up. But then all of a sudden, a whole bunch of people started showing up, right? And he was the one who said that at first the opposition to a war was a moral one, but then it became self-interested.
Yeah.
That everybody was protesting the war because they were afraid of going to the war, because they were afraid of going to get shot there. That I found really interesting. I found it really interesting, and the documentary didn't do enough with it. It never wanted to go in that direction of examining the fact that they were all self-interested little pricks.
Well, that was actually interesting you brought that up. In concluding the documentary, it was clear to me that I think there was a conscientious movement on Ken Burns. I think you said, to kind of not go too deep into the nuances of the anti-war protests. I actually think they come across the worst, and I think it's intentionally. I think, obviously Zimmerman comes across as a complete, not almost like a monstrosity.
They all come across as monstrous,
by the
and selfish.
Every single interview with the anti-war protesters by the end, outside of some of the veteran anti-war protesters, we'll get to that in a second. I got some angry things to say about them.
Too.
But by and large, all the true non-military anti-war protesters came across as very self-interested, and they admitted almost every time they were interviewed that, look, our tactics made it worse. Every time we got militant and we did our thing, the population turned against us. And it was at the last bit of the episode, or the last episode, they had one of the female anti-war protesters. She said she had a moment where she went to the Vietnam War Memorial, and she basically had not a nervous breakdown, but an emotional breakdown where she realized that she had to apologize essentially for the situation.
Yeah, but she was the one who was so self-interested in I'm on camera and I'm going to be like, oh, I'm so sorry and stuff. It sounded like so much bullshit.
I had a moment where I had skepticism of her point. I think it was genuine, but I think she phrased it ultimately as, we were kids too. I think those were her words. In other words, she tries to justify her position, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really work. I do think conscientiously he was anti those protesters, in part because, remember, he's not left-wing Democrat per se. He's establishment Democrat, and the establishment Democrats have to walk a fine line because, and the other guy who gets much more credit in this documentary than I would have loved, John Kerry, even though he's not interviewed, he's a rather central figure during the latter episodes.
Yeah,
because he was one of the leaders of the veterans anti-war.
Yeah, well, it's clear that it was a little bit of a push to shore up his bona fides, because at that time John Kerry was thinking about running for president. So anyway, go ahead. What were you saying?
But needless to say, so you do have his attempt to support some veteran protesters. This is generally an anti-war sentiment to this documentary, with some understanding of how we got to this position. But he needs to find that nice sweet spot where you don't insult the veterans, you're critical of the war without dismissing the soldiers and whatnot. So it's very clear where Ken Burns' heart was going to ultimately lead him. During this. But the thing that did bother me, even though I'm glad Burns gave this throwaway interview line, was that there were too many people coming across like John Kerry was so wonderful and eloquent about his anti-war sentiment as a soldier, but at least one guy said no. He went in very deep and constantly saying all of the atrocities that the American soldiers committed, and some of the other veterans were like, "Look, we were critical of the war, but God damn it, you made it seem like that was the standard."
Yeah, exactly.
And he said, "Yeah, sure." People freaked out. No one denied that. But his point was the idea that we were just going around looking for little younglings to shoot.
Yeah, it was that Japanese guy, the Japanese special forces, who wound up becoming a judge. He was the one who was really pissed off about that, I think, wasn't he?
It may have been him. It may have been another guy, but it may have been the Harvard professor who was annoyed about that. But it doesn't really matter. I mean, a lot of the veterans were like, "What the fuck?" But there was a certain degree where they tried to really elevate the veteran anti-war protesters. And what was interesting about those guys is it also felt like those guys were of two minds on a lot of things. And I don't blame them for it. There was one guy who's simultaneously loved John Kerry. yet also hated the fact that after the war, we just let the South go so fast and so deeply that it was an embarrassment. And I'm kind of like, well, you wanted us out. Us getting out kind of led to that. Us disassociating ourselves from it led to this. You have to realize this is, you're fucked no matter what you do. So, I would have liked for him to, not. It's not the interviewer's fault. I mean, he's living his life, but the documentary to recognize a little bit more obviously that even the anti-war protest and the sentiment afterwards created a situation which was just as bad just for other participants in this war.
Yeah, the thing that really bothers me about this documentary, the core thing, that they gloss it over really fast, okay? But the core fact is that Robert McNamara in 1965 came to the conclusion that the war was unwinnable. The Johnson administration knew they could not win. They knew from 65. And that's what was revealed in the Pentagon Papers, which they sort of also gloss over. Okay, and they keep trying to fling shit at Nixon all the time. Nixon, bad. But
what's interesting though,
but hang on. It's really, for me, it was a key moment because Burns fundamentally, I mean, he knows that McNamara knew by 65 that the war was unwinnable. Therefore, it was a pointless war. There was no reason. Everybody who died after 65 died for no reason because no victory could be achieved. If they thought in 65, well, we might win, and is what our champagne room would look like. Well, then, okay, you're going for it, fine. But they knew in 65 that they couldn't win, and still they went ahead. And so all those people, those young men on both sides, on all sides, who died pointlessly, needlessly, okay? And all that youth was just thrown away, and they knew it in 65. And Ken Burns does not emphasize that because it would mean that the Democrats were responsible for it. The Democrats of the Great Society programs were responsible for this catastrophe because there's no other way to look at it. It was a catastrophe for all involved. It was a pointless war. And what was so horrible for me watching it was that these guys would murder each other over some godforsaken hill that didn't even have a name. It just had a number. They'd murder each other by the bushel. And at the end of the war, at the end of the battle, it was pointless. They'd leave. And nobody would ever need the hill again because the hill didn't matter. It was just killing one another. I think, look, what happens to me is that I look at it from a very different perspective now that I'm 50 than when I was 20. And I can tell you right now, because when I was 20, I thought in a completely different way insofar as this. I would have still been, annoyed by the fact that it was pointless. But I would not have recognized at 20, as I do today, how the death of these young people, of these boys, of these children, it was snuffing out so much life and possibility, okay? Because here's something that you start to realize as you get older. You start to be a lot more conservative insofar as death, especially death of the young. When you're young and you get killed, or somebody your age gets killed, it's like, oh man, that was awful. But as you get older, you start to realize, holy shit, that kid died at age 20. I'm 50, and I know how rich those 30 years between 20 and 50 really are, and how the years between 0 and 20 don't mean shit. And the years between 20 and 50, they're filled with great experiences, both positive and negative, great highs and great lows, but it's that road travel that is so valuable. And to have it, a 20-year-old kid on the cusp of that road, getting snuffed out for no reason. Because at least, in some other wars, there was a clear and compelling reason for it. But these children died for nothing, and it pains me much, much more now. Because when I saw the images of dead bodies, because the documentary is strewn with these images of dead bodies, I look at that, right? At those young people dead, those children and women dead. And for me, it's not that I see those dead people, which is a horrible enough sight. It's the sense of that all that future life that they could have had is gone. And that for me is just, it's much worse and affects me now as an older man, much, much more than when I was a younger man.
Well, all of this is tied to that generation's severe lack of confidence in a certain way, at least for the soldiers who participated, right? They did not have a clear sense that, oh, either we were fighting the good war, or even that, to your point, this particular battle I was involved with led to something valuable, right?
Yeah.
Like you said, the hill was gone by the time it was over. It was just, to your point, and this is also somewhat part of the degree of fighting a defensive war for a country you're not entirely familiar with, tied to political reasons, older than a lot of these guys were, older than a lot of the guys who were fighting this war, shall we say. And, so you mix that together, plus the home front situation, it's you get a sense that people were afraid, like, to even make a decision, right? Because any decision that was made was going to have frightful consequences that they'd rather have not dealt with. And like I say, even the anti-war, or not even anti-war, let's just say the desire to end the conflict of American interests, you didn't know exactly what to do, because, like, what would we do that would benefit or harm our South Vietnamese allies? What would we do with regard to the grander political stage? It wasn't very clear what the best answer was going to be. And when you don't have that clarity, you just get the sense that any decision sucks. And anything I do now is really shitty. And it's even worse when you have a sense that this is inherited, right? The implications of and the reasons for even being at this war go back even before the fucking Eisenhower administration. I mean, like, Roosevelt, had
things and dealings with this.
Yeah. Exactly. So it's like, everybody's like, well, what the fuck are we doing?
All the way back to Ho Chi Minh when he was in Paris in 1919. As a young man with a letter there that he was trying to deliver to Woodrow Wilson when they were negotiating the League of Nations, right? It goes back to then. Mm-hmm. This shit has been going on for decades, right? And the Americans to have gone in there, God, it was just such a foolish decision. And for McNamara and therefore Johnson to have known in 1965 that it was unwinnable and pointless, okay? That it was unwinnable, therefore pointless.
And this is why this is why I consider any sin you want to throw at Nixon's conduct of the war is minuscule and trivial compared to Johnson and Kennedy and McNamara. Agree. Why? Because everything Nixon was doing, well, number one, they knew, but everything Nixon was doing, good decision, bad decision, was an attempt to extract the United States from the war. Even the expansions of the bombing, because what did he do? Mining the Gulf of Tonkin. Well, that's to limit the Soviet supplies getting in there. Yeah. Bombing Cambodia. Well, where do you think the fucking North Vietnamese armies were coming from?
Yeah, they were coming along the Ho Chi Minh on Cambodia.
Exactly. Bombing of Hanoi even more aggressively. All of this was in an effort to extract us from it. Well, he did it, and people are still kind of pissed of the way he did it.
I have a theory about this.
His method. Yeah.
I have a theory about this, okay? I think that it is the intelligentsia's psychodrama over the fact that their hero, John Kennedy, and his successor, Lyndon Johnson, and all those bright boys, McNamara, who were so popular in the Georgetown set, in all the Georgetown dinner parties and all the rest of it, who's close pals with Katharine Graham and Benjamin Bradley over at the Washington Post and all those fucking people, right? They were pissed that leadership led them off a fucking cliff in Vietnam. And so they projected it onto Nixon. All their rage and anger and impotence and fear that they might have to go because they were all a bunch of fucking cowards as far as I'm concerned. I mean, baby boomers, bottom line, they're fucking cowards. Okay, I despise the generation. They were all fucking cowards. They were all angry at Johnson, angry at Kennedy, at Saint Jack, and his perfect little virginal bride, Jackie Kennedy, who's just a whore, by the way. She was paid off by Joe Kennedy to marry John Kennedy. Okay, everybody knows that. She got paid $1 million, and her old man, Black Jack Bouvier's debts were paid off before she married John Kennedy. Everybody knows that. Okay. Everybody knows that when he was president, she was fucking Aristotle Onassis, and he went to the pier of some, I think it was in the Hamptons or something, and told her, get off that fucking boat, it's famously. But anyway, those godforsaken people, corrupt people, John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, McNamara, all those liars, assassins, murderers, because that's what they were responsible for this shithole, dumpster fire of a war. And the generation, the baby boomers, they couldn't handle it. They couldn't be grown-ups, put on the big boy pants and act like grown-ups and say that their heroes had been wrong and evil and done horrible, evil things. No, they couldn't say that, so they projected it onto Nixon because it was easy. Because also,
Well,
there's another class issue going on, because they
yes,
viewed
and
Nixon as
that's what I want to get
déclassé.
into.
They viewed him as
Yeah,
déclassé, and he was much more sophisticated and intelligent than they were. And that
well,
pisses them off even more.
Well,
What?
that's the thing. That's the thing. Because remember, the leadership here, in Jack, because all of it was Jack's inner circle of the wisest men on the planet.
Yeah.
All of them were World War II veterans of various degrees or operatives who knew what they were doing. Remember, Johnson, Master of the Senate, knew what he was fucking doing politically, internally. Yeah. These guys, couldn't manage the situation, even to their best efforts, of using data and figures. It just didn't work for them. Nixon, to your point, very crude guy, in many regards. Like I said, that when they say Nixon was talking about the fucking Jews and all these other cocksuckers, I mean, you can listen to the audio. He said what he talked like that. There's no lying about it. But he knew, to your point, how to operate and do a lot of these things. And the other thing that really bothered them, I think, he was not afraid to conduct the war. And even if his goal was very specifically get the fuck out, his conduct of the war meant, led to that outcome. That's what fucking pissed them off to no end. And yes, the fact that he didn't come, he lacked the bona fides that they did, makes it even worse. And people were out to get Nixon from before he even ran for president this time around. You remember when he ran for governor of California, and I want to say 64, and he said, 62. You won't have Nixon to kick around. 62. You wouldn't have Nixon to kick around anymore.
Yeah, they laughed at him.
Actually, my favorite Oliver Stone movie actually is Nixon, by the way.
Well, I don't know about that, but my point about Nixon, though, is that he might have been déclassé in their eyes, but he knew about geopolitics in a way that they did not. They did not understand at all. Johnson and Kennedy just did not get it at all, and Nixon did. And Nixon got the job done. He realized that fighting over Vietnam was stupid. You had to fight on a higher chessboard. And you didn't fight, you negotiated. And you played off the two big guys against one another, which is what he did. He played off the Chinese against the Soviets. The Soviets and the Chinese at one point, because of what Nixon was doing, they almost came to a war over Mongolia and Manchuria back in, I think it was 72. They really nearly came to a nuclear war over that shit. I mean, apparently it was awfully close. He was a master at playing off his opponents. And that's what he did. He elevated the game, He got the Soviets and the Chinese on his side over the issue of Vietnam to pressure them, like you said before, to pressure the North Vietnamese to sign on the dotted line, Look, he was a better chess player. Had he been president in 1960, Vietnam never would have happened. It simply never would have happened because he would have realized what was what. And he would have said, no, this is pointless. The South is corrupt. We have to, we might have to do some things, or else, buttress Thailand and Laos and Cambodia. But we're not going to get fucking involved in South Vietnam because it's a fucking disaster. He would have been wise enough to know that, okay? Think of what would have happened if he'd been president in 1961. It would have been a completely different history. Yeah.
Well, you don't get the history you want. You get what you get.
Yeah, but here's the thing. I want to make a further point on this, because I realized as watching the Ken Burns documentary and how much Nixon did to end the war. And by the way, Burns repeatedly refers to the masterful political decision of Nixon to create the lottery, because it took the wind out of the sails of the anti-war protests, which is, of course, what he wanted. But also the fact that he was withdrawing troops meant that you didn't need the full-on draft as you had before. What was interesting to me was, okay, like I said before, it seems to me that there's some psychodrama of the lefts, the liberals, those people against Nixon, right? It seems to me that there's a parallel situation going on today. I only want to bring this up because it's something that I'm deeply troubled by. Is, the Obama administration was a horrible administration in every front, domestically, in foreign policy, in terms of economics. It doubled the debt. It did all kinds of stuff that we're actually going to get into in a future episode, right? But everybody realizes that he was a horrible president, okay? And I think that the Democrats, the liberals, they know this, and they are unable to face that reality, and so they are projecting it onto Trump. And the closer that it appears that Obama committed egregious acts by using government agencies to change the outcome of the 2016 election, which is becoming increasingly clear as we're recording this. I think that we're going to see more of that psychodrama play out, where it's not merely going to be that the leftists start to, get angrier and angrier at Trump. They're going to go out of their minds because it means that their hero, their black savior, was, to use a word, worse than Nixonian.
Well, we'll see how his Netflix deal kind of clears that up.
Yeah, that's pathetic. But anyway, going back to the Vietnam thing. Oh man, I'm just like, here's the other thing. See, I'd always grown up with the notion that Nixon was almost as equally responsible about Vietnam as Johnson and Kennedy, if not more so, because so many of the people who created the culture that I consumed and that I was a part of emphasized this. But looking at the hard reality of it, even in this documentary that's done by a leftist, he can't deny the truth that he was getting out as quickly as possible. He wanted this off his plate as quickly as possible, and he was doing everything in his power to do so. He was more responsible for getting out of this war than anybody else. I also suspect that he got out of the Vietnam War quicker than had Hubert Humphrey won the election. I mean, that really wasn't a possibility, but imagine if he had. I think Hubert Humphrey would have dragged out the war for another 8 years, and with inconclusively, so as not to spoil the legacy of his predecessor, I mean, that's my honest opinion. I think that Nixon was a fucking brilliant president. He looks better because of this documentary, even as this documentary is trying to fling shit at him with both hands.
Well, here's the thing you got to realize. The complications and the sort of double talk you're talking about from the quote-unquote left-wingers, they're really the Democrats that have this problem. Real communist left-wingers don't have a fucking problem on this issue.
Yeah.
They know that all presidents have some sense involvement in it, and their position was that this was a war above and beyond any particular administration. So they've never had a problem saying Johnson was a son of a bitch. I do think, and this is the result of who's making this, has this problem. And it also, that does remind me, it's like tangential, but it's related. I don't think this is a true imperial war in the two ways that people like to say that this is an imperial war. One, either that it was there so that big companies like Bell Helicopter or Raytheon or whoever the missile providers were selling equipment, and they wanted the war just so they could sell that. It really, you don't see evidence that truly was why it was a driving force of starting the war. The other thing you don't get, people have tried to throw this one around that, there's oil in them Gulf of Tonkin business, and so we got to extract economic wealth out of the country. You really don't even get that view either. It's above and beyond all of those things, and it's somewhat messier than that. So that's actually something I did want to, just double back on that. I don't think you really see that here. You see a lot more just fucked up. It's just fucked up policy that was even older than that regard. And then to your point, Nixon was around long enough too to recognize this complication. Remember, Nixon was vice president for 8 years, right, and a very active vice president as well. He was to the point he was involved and aware of what was going on in terms of like the Bay of Pigs, Latin America, all sorts of international things, because that was his bugaboo. That was his specialty. Yeah,
and he traveled a lot as vice president. I read somewhere that at first it was a combination that Eisenhower didn't want him around, and that Nixon genuinely enjoyed seeing new places. Okay, which is kind of interesting, because very parenthetically. You know why Tom Cruise is such a huge movie star? Because his movies don't make the money that in the States that they used to, but he still commands top dollar. Because in the rest of the world, he's a huge star and always will be, right? Everybody goes to see his movies everywhere, no matter how shitty the movie is. And so he has a guaranteed foreign box office. Do you know why? Because back in the very early 80s, when he had his first string of hits with Risky Business, and Top Gun and so forth, he insisted on traveling overseas, not because he was such a diligent guy who wanted to, shore up the movie, but because he wanted to see foreign countries, because he'd never traveled outside the United States. And because of that, he just built up this huge network of people who he'd visit and knew around the world. And so they support his movies. And that's why he has such a huge fan base in Japan and China and all kinds of weird places that you wouldn't have expected somebody like Tom Cruise to have such a big following. But it's precisely because he liked traveling. Okay, sometimes traveling can give you all kinds of benefits, and for Nixon, obviously, it gave him perspective.
Well, that's interesting. It's another detail that you could think of the difference between the two wars. Like the Johnson and Kennedy wars were very bureaucratic in a way. By that, I said, it was very much like guys in the office doing their spreadsheets, trying to figure out what to do, figuring out the right kill ratios to get success. They lacked a sense of immediacy to the situation to understand what the fuck was going on. Nixon, like I said, it was a little bit more clear cut, even though it was, there was some complications, and he would do, admittedly odd things, but he got to the point of what he wanted to do, and I think that really spells the difference between those kinds of the 8 years of the Kennedy-Johnson war, and then the remaining, let's say, 4-ish years of the.
There was another thing about the Kennedy-Johnson administration, because it really was one continuous administration. The heads changed, but the body remained the same. They were so lacking in urbanity. They were so pedestrian, so small town, so they were in a bubble. They were in their little Georgetown bubble. They had no fucking idea about the rest of the world. And that's something that I've noticed, by the way, of American, the American upper class in general is very
provincial.
Provincial. You know who else is very provincial? Parisian French. It's really funny.
Yeah.
I lived in Paris for a bit, long enough to realize that the French are provincial. They have no idea about the rest of the world, and they think that Paris is it, which is, a small town mentality, provincial mentality. Because only a provincial would think that their own village or town is the center of the universe. It's very, very amusing. And that's what you see in the Johnson-Kennedy administration. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're right. It's pretty much there's 3 cities. It's D.C., it's New York, and to a certain extent, like the east, the west coast.
The Acela corridor. Yeah. That's it. They don't see anything else. But Nixon was urbane. He might have been lower middle class, but he was urbane. He was urbane. He was sophisticated. He was a true globalist. Let's face facts. And globalist in the negative sense that we view it. Mm-hmm.
But I would also say that Nixon understood the small town America more than any of the Kennedy, or Johnson was a little bit better than Kennedy, but still those guys were locked in the Beltway corridor mentality. Yeah. Nixon at least he at least gave the impression that that the smaller guys were had something in common with them. Even my grandmother's Russian. Mm-hmm. She says, like, I like Nixon. He's like me. And like my dad even said, even though my dad has come to respect Nixon more, he's like, well, he's doing well for himself now, and everything. But Nixon had a connection to the average Joe that others really didn't. Because I think what bonds them to him, and you saw it in the movie Joe, right? Which was, obliquely you saw it. And the hard hats were referenced in this documentary, by the way. What you saw in them is they understood that the shit thrown on Nixon reminded them of the shit thrown on them.
Yeah. 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 Goddamn right.
And that's another parallel to Trump as well.
Yeah.
And I think it ties to your theory of the psychodrama at play here. It's like they don't just hate Nixon. They hate all of the America that Nixon kind of ties himself to or represents, the great, silent majority.
Masses, yeah. Exactly. And the thing is about this, but it's not just that. It's not just that Nixon was the stalwart middle classes that they hate and look down on. No. It was also their anger and hatred at the previous administrations. In the Trump case, it's the Obama administration. In the Nixon case, it was the Johnson-Kennedy administrations. Because at heart, they knew that what they were doing was illegal. They knew that Johnson lied with every breath that he took. He lied all the time about every fucking thing. He conducted a secret war, for crying out loud. That's what he was doing, It was insane. And they don't talk about the economics of the situation. The Vietnam War was catastrophic for the American economy. In a very real sense, it has never recovered from it. And let's not even go into the Great Society programs, which were also catastrophic, right? On a financial level, Jesus Christ. And forget about the social impact that it had of decimating the black families, black working classes. It just decimated them It was a catastrophe. The Johnson administration, the more I look at it, the more perspective we have, the more I think it is catastrophic and worse. It was foreseeably catastrophic. You could see what they were doing would end in ruin of the republic. Okay, you could see it. The Vietnam War, obviously, but the Great Society programs, they were undermining. Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote the what was the name of that famous essay? You know the one I'm talking about? The one that got him excommunicated. Yeah, he wrote it in his, I'm going to look it up while you're talking.
For those of you who don't know, Daniel Patrick Moynihan was the senator of New York, I believe, was considered one of the intellectual heavyweights of the American Senate, a Democrat, but certainly much more capable than most of them. I think the only one as intellectually capable as him was Eugene McCarthy, another player at this time in '68. He was the left-wing opposition to the war, sort of like McGovern, but a lot more intelligent. And ironically enough, Robert Kennedy attacked him from the right, saying this guy just wants to appease the fucking North Vietnamese and negotiate and everything. Let us not yet another feather in the cap of why you should never, ever listen to a fucking Kennedy ever.
Yeah.
And just throw that family over the fucking bridge, or at least throw them into the same black water they throw their mistresses.
Yeah. I hate to say it, but those sons of bitches earned the bullets that they got. Look, Daniel Patrick Moynihan would become a U.S. senator, a very well-respected U.S. senator. He was a great man. And he was a sociologist, and he was serving as Assistant Secretary of Labor under President Johnson. And in 1965, okay, a key year, he wrote The Negro Family, The Case for National Action. I'm reading from Wikipedia. Moynihan argued that the rise in black single-mother families was caused not by a lack of jobs, but by a destructive vein in ghetto culture, which could be traced to slavery times and continued discrimination in the American South under Jim Crow. And he concluded, he controversially concluded that the high rate of families headed by single mothers would greatly hinder progress of blacks towards economic and political equality, which is like fucking A, right? And it was basically tacitly saying that the Great Society programs would accentuate the growth of single mother households among the black community, and that it would be catastrophic for blacks. 50 years later, where are we at? The blacks are just like, we just shake our heads, right? Or if we're liberals, we like elevate them with affirmative action and all kinds of social justice warrior bullshit to elevate them to positions that they have not earned, and they usually fuck up pretty righteously, pretty quickly, right?
But you also, funny enough, you saw this in the war itself, which I thought was compelling, which was the idea like we don't know what to do with our black population at the end of the day. They're like, oh, we'll throw them into the army. Oh, they're getting they're bearing more brunt of the casualties than others. Okay, we've got to figure out something to do. It's like it's just tacitly like just shifting the fucking cups around, waiting for a solution to present itself, which never happened.
Yeah. The black population of America is just. It's just this undigestible thing that it refuses to assimilate. It refuses to go away. It's always going to be with the United States, and that's the cross that the United States is going to have to bear, because the United States is not the only country, or not even the only Western democracy that had a slave population. But the thing is, the slave populations in the other Western democracies became assimilated into the wider population and essentially disappeared. There are some places where they're more noticeable than others, like, for instance, Brazil. But in a lot of other countries, like in Argentina and Uruguay and Chile, for instance, they were just drifted and disappeared into the general population. Because there are black people of African descent in those three countries. You walk down the street of Montevideo, Buenos Aires, or Santiago, most people are white or sort of like, indigenous a little bit, right? But all of them, or most of them, have some black family in their distant past. But in the United States, that population was never integrated. And so we have the problem that we have today. So, yeah.
But going back to the war, because what we just talked about, the idea of like not knowing what to do with it, that was the other kind of thing that lingered with me even after our whole discussion about Nixon and Johnson and everything, was that even after the war, you really got a sense that we have no idea what to fucking deal with it in terms of memory, in terms of how to even represent it. It was just like the sooner we can get it out of our heads, the better. And even one of the things that was kind of interesting is the various takes you get on the Vietnam War memorial, which was very interesting. It's like you had some people who hated it; they thought it just represented a big gash on the memory,
gash of shame,
the black gash of shame, or others who thought that why are you even representing it in the first place? It's like all of the prejudices you have come to bear, and you get the sense that people just want to say, let's just figure out a way to minimize discussion of this topic.
Yeah. I have to say, by the way, that I was a 14-year-old boy when that whole controversy happened. I remember it very clearly, and I remember looking at the pictures of it, and I thought, well, it looks kind of weird, and but then I actually went to the memorial later when I think I was in my 20s the first time I saw it, and it truly is a remarkable monument. It really is. I think. I personally think that it is one of the most beautiful and profound war memorials ever made. I truly do think that. Its simplicity and the way that it really is a scar over the land, quite deliberately so. And it's a remarkable achievement. The scar covered over with the names of all the people who died there, I on an aesthetic level, okay, I can't think of any memorial that comes close to it. You?
No, I agree. I've heard many variations on this argument that it's one of the best memorials the country's ever made. And it's almost a shock in retrospect to think that anybody could be offended by it.
It's understandable. It's understandable. At the time, it was a little too modern, if not postmodern, to really get a grip on when you saw the diagram. But when you see it in real life, it comes together.
That's what I mean. Like, it's in that effectiveness of it, and you got that from the documentary. Everybody who kind of, even the people who opposed it, once they're there, they get it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. No. I mean, a truly remarkable achievement that a 19-year-old child could have done this. Okay, is remarkable. I mean, I think that she was just blessed by God, because it really is a remarkable piece of work. It's so simple, and it's also remarkable that the committee that made the decision landed on that, had the vision to see how brilliant it would truly be. You have to give them credit.
Yeah. Yeah, and the couple of details. One, what's interesting is actually the architect is Asian. She's a descendant of Chinese refugees from the Maoists, essentially, I think.
Yeah.
And the other interesting thing is, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong. That was in the early '80s when this came up, right?
Yeah, it was. If memory serves me right, around 1980, 82, they were raising funds, and they settled on this design. And there was a whole shitstorm, I remember, in 81, 82. People really hated the decision. Even the people who were fundraising, a lot of them said that, I'm not going to put one red cent in this fucking thing. And I do believe that, okay, I'm not going to mention any names as to who was opposed, because I honestly have forgotten. But there were a lot of prominent people who were against it. I mean, virulently against it. And they were, I remember they were politicians who had served in Vietnam who were against it. And, let's be thankful that they didn't win that argument, because, and look, if you look at it, it looks weird, okay? It looks weird and bizarre, and it doesn't look like it's going to work. The fact that it does work is, it's remarkable. It really is a remarkable monument.
Well, my main point about it, though, is that it took approximately 7 to 10 years after conflict ended of American participation to even get this thing anywhere near in a kind of existent faction. And I think that's the point. And we had talked about this obliquely in other subjects. It took a long time to start talking about Vietnam again, be it either in art, in film, in books, sometimes not even very effectively. In the documentary, they actually have a soldier, I think Tim O'Connell or something, I forget exactly the name, but he's an author of short stories involved with the war, and I got to be honest, just the excerpts I heard from him, they're not. I mean, they're almost like outsider art. It's like it's not very compelling to me, other than okay, it's a soldier who wrote this,
When
and it just
you're
takes.
talking about the things he carried, the things they carried.
Yeah, things he carried. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's not effective.
I
for
read
me.
that in college. I thought it was a crappy collection of stories. There was only one that was interesting, The Sweetheart of the Sutra Bong or something like that. It was about a woman who was smuggled into North Vietnam, the sweetheart of one of the soldiers. And the woman there, she becomes, basically special forces. She sort of like loses her mind. It was an interesting story, but thematically pointless. I actually think that the best Vietnam movie ever made was Forrest Gump. I mean, in terms of social commentary of it, but that's I'll comment into another issue. I thought Tim O'Brien is an overrated writer. I don't think that he's
like I think it was funny
interest.
enough. The other thing is like the only, in terms of just pure books, the only compelling story about Vietnam that I've encountered thus far was actually The Quiet American, which is a Catholic British commentary on the early, kind of bubblings of American involvement in the war. And I still think, that still kind of hasn't been beat on a literary sense. Movie-wise is a little bit different, but it took a while to deal with this. Like I said, the memorial takes 10 years at least to get up. Movies that are dealing with the war don't really start until about 78. So about, let's say, 5 years after the actual conflict ends. I just get a sense that, and I even feel this now, I mean, the boomers have conscientious talk about the war largely from a we were opposed to it kind of attitude, and sometimes the soldiers will remember, but by and large it's like we would prefer to not talk about this.
Well, what's interesting is that, see, the books that have come out of, okay, let's talk about the different art. Okay, the first art that really started happening was like there was Coming Home and The Deer Hunter. Those were the first movies that sort of like hit the scene, and those hit the scene in what, 77, 78, 78, right?
78.
And then 79 came Apocalypse Now, which I actually think is the best Vietnam movie. I don't think that anything really comes close to it. Okay, you and I have argued because Dr. Benway has actually never seen the original cut of the movie. He's only seen the Redux cut, which is, I think, is a little flabby. A lot of scenes that could have been cut, that were cut in the original version. But be that as it may, the Apocalypse Now, in whatever version you see it, the psychedelia and insanity really captures that time, especially the 69-70 period, where things seem to have spiraled out of control in Vietnam insofar as the behavior of the soldiers, right? 68, 69, that period where they really were fragging officers who were, a little bit ornery or whatever.
Just to clarify, fragging means basically assassinating your officer, or mutiny, more or less.
Yeah, it was using a fragmentation grenade, tossing a fragmentation grenade into the tent where a commanding officer was in order to kill him. And there were enough of these cases that the term became fragging. And it was a known problem, because what would happen was that soldiers who felt that a commanding officer was too aggressive and too willing to engage with the enemy would be warned. They would warn, rather, this commanding officer not to do that. And if he kept on doing it and putting soldiers' lives at risk, the soldiers would kill him because they didn't want to really fight the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong, which goes to show you the demoralization and collapse of the American military by 69, which is when this was starting to happen on a fairly regular basis.
Plus an opioid epidemic as well, to again tie it to the contemporary situation. The amount of soldiers addicted to opioids. What was it like? I can't give you the exact numbers.
40%.
It was like
40%. They suspected 40% were smoking pot on a regular basis. Yeah.
And even harder stuff as well.
Yeah. But I mean, 40 to cover pot. Basically, 40%. Well, if pot is the gateway drug, right? 40% were smoking it initially, yeah. And anyway, and by the way, in the documentary, it showed that thing that I thought in Platoon was just a weird phallic joke, where they were blowing pot smoke through the barrel of their machine guns or shotguns or what have you, that the soldiers were doing this. I thought that was like a weird thing out of Platoon, and it actually happened. They actually did this. Fucking weird. Yep. I find it kind of creepy and gay, but whatever. Anyway, the point is, what to me was interesting was of the art. The movies were great. Okay. Certainly, you could argue all you want about Deer Hunter, but it is a very interesting movie. It is intellectually, there's a lot to chew on. I think it's bombastic and stupid, and nothing like any kind of Russian roulette was ever played by anybody, except I'm sure some random incident of somebody playing Russian roulette. But betting on Russian roulette, I've never heard of that actually happening, and nobody's ever said that this is actually true. But as a metaphor, it's kind of interesting. The picture is kind of interesting, or I mean, intellectually interesting. Apocalypse Now is the superior picture. Coming Home is this saccharine bullshit. And I want to talk about Coming Home, which won Jon Voight and Jane Fonda Oscars for Best Actor and Actress, respectively.
And the two lesser performances of the movie compared to the real star of the movie, Bruce Dern.
Yeah, and here's the thing that I think about Coming Home. And those awards, it's once more the intellectual classes just spitting on America, because and on the majority of the population of America, of the working classes of America, for all their bullshit talk of being liberal, they look down and disrespect the working classes so much because Jane Fonda, Hanoi Jane, that fucking cunt, went to North Vietnam and celebrated and gave all kinds of speeches in favor of the North Vietnamese, and posed with the guns that were shooting down American soldiers, American flyers.
It was posing with the gun that was the worst, because you can see it in the documentary, and you can see it everywhere. She was giddy with glee. She was clapping her hands, sitting on the anti-aircraft gun.
Yes,
and like as the soldiers, one of the soldiers, the anti-Vietnam War soldier said, it was hardest with her because there were other people who went there and played lip service to the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese. She was the only one who we fantasized over.
Yeah.
The guys they love Barbarella. Fucking, I love Barbarella.
Yeah, every guy jerked off to Barbarella.
Everybody jerked off to Barbarella.
Sure.
Exactly. And the fact that she did that, it was because there was an intimate relationship associated with anybody who's a pinup girl, and the fact that she did that was there. And then it's really kind of Coming Home.
It's really funny about feminists and male masturbation. They don't understand the relationship, because when you're masturbating to some image, like say Jane Fonda and Barbarella, just for the sake of argument, you see a guy who's jerking off to that image, he does feel a certain kind of, like, I don't want to call it tenderness, but affection.
It's an attachment. It's an attachment.
Yeah. And you never masturbate to some image that you find hateful. On the contrary, you masturbate to an image that you find endearing or lovable, or something that you want to...
Coach, let us be clear. You masturbate to something you love. You can fuck something you hate, though.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you can fuck something you hate, but you only masturbate to something you love. Yes, exactly. There. I've rewritten it, I've rewritten your rewrite, and I think that we got it. We got the phrase down. Yes, you can fuck something you hate, but you only jerk off to something you love, right? And and this is true.
That's going in the records. I'm sorry. I just want to chew on this a little bit more, because we have to relish this codification of the situation.
I like this editorial back and forth. We took an idea. We honed it back and forth, and it came out just right. I mean, we could just
the most used, yeah.
Yes. But it's true, and the woman that you masturbate to, is and she goes and does a betrayal like that. You don't get over it. It's weird, but you don't. It's something that fucks your head, because it's basically. I can understand the soldier. What was that? Musgrave was the name of that guy?
Yeah, or something very close to it. Yeah.
Yeah, I like, by the way, the testimonials. They were of essentially random guys. The only one I knew was Tim O'Brien. Okay. Tim O'Brien, by the way, he is taught in every class about war, about Vietnam, and all the rest of it. So he makes a decent living from the sales of his one collection, the things they carried, rather. But he's a crappy writer. He's not an interesting writer. And in point of fact, nothing good, no good literature has come out of Vietnam. Tree of Smoke was a piece of shit. You read that? The Dennis Johnson book?
I couldn't finish it. But one book I will say is worth it, but it's not true. Mm-hmm. It is not literature. The Dispatches by Michael Hare is the only exception, I'd say, because Michael Hare, Michael Hare, if you haven't read The Dispatches, because he is the writer of the narration in Apocalypse Now, and he is the writer of the overall movie of A Full Metal Jacket. So you do know how his writing is if you haven't read Dispatches. I think that's the only thing close to being digestible for me. I don't know if you've read them.
No, I haven't read Dispatches. Is it any good?
It sounds very much like Apocalypse Now. So
well, the thing that I find, what I have noticed is that usually the people who participate in some great event are not very good at writing about it because they're so focused on their immediate experience, and so they don't know how to generalize it, how to make it beyond themselves. Coppola had never served in Vietnam, and neither had John Milius, who wrote the original script of Apocalypse Now and came up with the name Apocalypse Now.
Though he desperately wanted to serve, my God.
Yeah, but for some reason, I think his eyes or something like that, they wouldn't let him.
He physically couldn't do it.
Yeah. But he was crazy to go, and he was the one who came up with the title Apocalypse Now because he saw the sign that said Peace Now, and he was like, "Fuck that, Apocalypse Now," and great, that's a great title, My thinking about Apocalypse Now is it's a great picture. It's not really about war. It's about how men can wind up going insane. That's what it is.
It's about the temperament of war more so than the war, I would say. And it's broader than just war. It's the temperament of conflict.
Yeah. And what I think also is that it transcended Vietnam, which is at the end of the day what great art should do. It should transcend its setting or its theme. And none of the art about Vietnam has transcended its theme. It has not gone beyond it, except for Apocalypse Now. And to a certain extent, The Deer Hunter, because The Deer Hunter is just a fucking crazy-ass picture. It has nothing to do with Vietnam. It's just the crazy psychodrama going on in Michael Cimino's head that, retrospectively, I'm surprised that the picture did as well as it did at the time.
Well, but that was actually part of the reason people were throwing shade back at Heaven's Gate, because there was a period of reassessment where they said, we were too nice to The Deer Hunter. Let's add a little bit more fuel to the fuck you Heaven's Gate fire. There was a reassessment going on at that.
No, I agree. But okay, going back to Vietnam, we sort of like strayed into the art, but I want to go back to the leadership. Okay, yes. McNamara. McNamara is a man whom I am. The more time passes, the more I despise him. Back in, I think it was 2005 or 2007, sometimes back then, Errol Morris came out with this documentary. 2003. The Fog of War. I saw that picture. Great picture. Like all Errol Morris pictures, it's fundamentally simple, but his approach is very effective. And it's a great picture. McNamara, he knew from the get-go. That's when it first came out that he knew in 1965 that it was unwinnable. And how can I put this? The fact that so many liberals say, oh, all we need to do is just put everything in the hands of good managers and all will be well. I want to just slap them around, because that's what happened in 1965. We put everything, all our eggs, the United States put all of its eggs into the hands of these, upright, decent managers. And what did they do? They went and fucked it up in a war that they knew could not be won. It was just insane.
Well, this is the thing. The readings of The Fog of War that gets me up in arms is the following, and I think it's a disaster when you read it this way. They say, you gotta hand it to McNamara. He's begging for forgiveness. I think he's learned his lesson. No, that's not the point of begging for forgiveness. He's begging because he will never be forgiven, and he can't forgive himself. You cannot let a guy like that be able to dictate the decisions again. The man has committed an unforgivable sin and will live the rest of his life begging for something he could never be given. And the idea that, it's like, oh, if we could only find more men like Robert McNamara. No, when they had the chance, he failed. And those guys, just the fact that afterwards he's begging for forgiveness suddenly says we need more men like him. No, you do not need more men like men. You need men who chose not to do what he did.
There's also something else that I find deeply disturbing in our culture, is that, you see, McNamara never failed, right? and he was given more and more authority and responsibility, and he was celebrated even more and more. He got into the right dinner parties and all the rest of it. But you see, only by failure do you truly learn. And only by failure is the only thing that tempers you and gives you humility. You cannot learn humility except by way of failure. In my own life, I've realized I've had tremendous and catastrophic failures of different sorts that I'm certainly not going to get into. But the point I'm trying to make, it was only after those failures that I realized certain things. And I realized certain attitudes that I'd had before when I've been like, shiny and spotless, that only after failure could I understand, could I realize the arrogance of my previous position, my previous words, my previous deeds. But see, a man like McNamara, which is what our society uplifts, the perfect spotless man, he will always be arrogant. He will always be thinking that he knows better, and that everybody else is a fool, because he's always succeeded. So he will get to a major decision with that arrogance, not confidence, arrogance, because there's a difference. And he will make catastrophic decisions and not realize the blindness that he's falling for. Okay.
Well, my favorite story that kind of sums him up is, remember, he was a guy who relied on figures and analysis. Very common in business today, by the way. So take this with a grain of salt. This is the criticism of this will criticize a lot more than just McNamara.
Yeah.
McNamara's decided, we're going to create a formula to calculate all of the variables you could conceivably consider to figure out when the war will be won. And they gathered all sorts of data. It's like more so than the computers at the time could calculate in a reasonable amount of time. And by the time they were done calculating, the computer decided, and I think the calculation was finished in 1968, that you had effectively won the war in 1965.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great story. I don't know if it's true or apocryphal. It's too good to check.
It was recounted in the documentary.
But it was recounted in the documentary. But I don't know if it was an apocryphal story. It doesn't matter. The point is completely accurate. All their calculations in 1968 threw up the undeniable result, the undeniable conclusion that the war had been won 3 years before. Yeah, right, exactly. These guys that how could I put it? The documentary touches on this a little bit. The urge to quantify everything, and the thousands upon thousands of pages a month. There was like 90,000 pages of data a month, an amount of information that no human being on earth could possibly master. All of this data, for what? It was pointless. They were just collecting data, and you can only imagine the infrastructure necessary to carry out this pointless computing. It was just hilarious.
Well, here's the thing, and I always bring this up when I'm interviewing people who want a job at our company, because we get a lot of quantitative people. I always tell them, look, you can make a model say whatever you want. What's fundamentally important is you need to understand what's going in, because your understanding of what's going in is defining how the algorithm works. And if you can't do that, if you can't provide me the compelling story, your analysis means nothing to me. The saying in the business is garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah.
And that what was going on fundamentally at McNamara. He thought like, well, if I just throw everything in there, I'll figure out an answer. Which means he lacked the fundamental understanding of what was going on. And later in life, he recognized that, but it was too late.
Yeah, exactly. After a catastrophic failure that cost, thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of lives ultimately. It was too fucking late. But that's the thing. See, our democracy, our society does not privilege people who have failed, because the people who have failed have learned from their mistakes. We were talking about how Nixon would not have made the same mistakes of Vietnam that Kennedy and Johnson did had he won in 1960. Or let me phrase it, had the election not been stolen from him in 1960 by your compadre, Daley.
Two states. There were two states. Texas and Illinois were in question.
Yeah. Well, of course, Johnson. What do you think happened there? But anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is, Nixon failed in the 1962 campaign, and he had a number of years in the wilderness, and he wrote about this at great length in his memoirs. And he said that they were the best times of his life in many ways because he learned the most during those times. And yeah, perhaps had he been president in 1960, he would have committed the same mistakes. And the fact that he lost the governorship of California in 62 and was in the wilderness for several years after that before returning in 68. Yeah, that must have given him something, very powerful lessons as to what was needed to not just win, but to succeed. And my
But here's the other thing that's bothersome about this whole situation is that in theory, Vietnam could have easily become that moment of failure which we learned from. And to a certain extent, there were moments when it felt like we were. But by the time we have reintroduced, and I lay this again, you can yell at me, but our crowd won't. When Bill Clinton, the liberal interventionist, comes in, now that the Cold War is over, we're going to make the world of liberal democracies.
Yeah.
And it's completely reproducing the worst problem. Although even worse than Vietnam, because at least with Vietnam, you can say, look, there are external issues that were out of our control that I understand. And I recognize in myself, hey, look, if I were in this position, I worry that I would have gotten into the same stupid decisions as well. I get the foreign and the international political structures that led you to think we have to do something in Vietnam. It's worse now because there were no external political factors suggesting we needed to do these re-engineering exercises.
Yeah.
But we chose to do them anyway.
Yeah. Out of hubris. Yeah. At least you could argue and argue realistically that the commies are out to get us. But this was just for no reason. Everything that's happened in the Middle East, it was pointless. Pointless. And I do believe that over time, people are going to start to realize more and more that it was under pressure by foreign influences that led us to create catastrophe in the Middle East to the benefit of foreign powers, specifically Israel and Saudi Arabia. It seems to me that people retrospectively will realize that that was the case. Now, whether it will matter or not politically will depend on how quickly that realization spreads throughout the body politic. If it's just because at this point in time, I don't think that most historians who are serious about studying this issue can say, oh yeah, the Israelis and the Saudis had nothing to do with our adventures in the Middle East. Bullshit. Everybody knows what's what. Everybody knows that these foreign adventures were instigated and pressured and pushed and cajoled by those two countries.
Well, here's the interesting thing.
Will the people realize it? I don't know.
This is the thought I had watching the last few episodes of this documentary. I thought to myself, 20, 30 years from now, whatever the magic number, would we see a version like this for the Iraq wars? My gut reaction was to say no, because we don't even remember them happening in the moment that they're happening. We know the news stories, but we don't have this visceral experience.
Yeah, but
was happening on the streets.
For the obvious reason that today the American military is a subgroup within the body politic. See, the American military before, people were drafted from all walks of life. Clint Eastwood fought in Korea. He nearly died there, as a matter of fact, And
I looked that up. I don't think it was him. It must have been someone else.
Who, Clint Eastwood?
Yeah, it was. I don't think Clint Eastwood served. I couldn't find info of it.
Yeah. He fought in. He was in Korea. He's a Korean War veteran.
I don't believe he is, but needless to say,
okay,
somebody.
Well, I understand that. Well, I'll look it up real quick as we're going. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that people. What you call it? During Vietnam, there were several congressmen and senators who had sons fighting in the war. Okay, they were there. Hey, John McCain Jr., the current senator who's dying and will find a place in hell, a reserve just for him, a very warm place in hell, I hope. Just for him, the son of a bitch. Anyway, he was the son of the commanding naval officer of NATO forces in Europe at the time when that he was shot down. Okay, people had skin in the game, is what I'm trying to say. But now you have a subgroup of people who are in the military, and they are all volunteer. They are low and middle class. They have no intersection with the upper classes or the leadership classes, except in bureaucratic settings. The leadership doesn't have skin in the game. The upper classes don't have any skin in the game. They don't have their sons and daughters fighting and dying in these foreign wars. Okay, and so the memory of it just disappears. See, and
Right.
yeah, the
I
cultural
completely
memory.
agree. There was an interesting. You even saw it in the documentary at a moving point, because I told you that I was really interested in at the end of the documentary when they're talking about the collapse of Saigon. The ambassador to Saigon, to the South, refused to officially say we have to start evacuating, because he didn't want to give the impression that they were just abandoning ship. It was probably a wrong decision, but he did that. And part of the impetus was that I think he lost a son in the war, and he could not bring himself to abandon the situation. It's hard to envision that again, right? There's some exceptions for sure. Certain senators do have children in the army.
Mm-hmm.
It's not as consistent anymore, in part because, to your point, we don't have the assumption that everybody's doing some degree of service in a matter of crisis. It's kind of forgotten now. It's like a profession. Some guys are going to go off. You probably don't know them. They'll do the thing, and it's they'll come back or they won't come back, and it's even our protests are muted because, to your point, nobody feels self-interested in the same way. Selfishly say, I'm worried about going to the war myself.
Yeah.
You don't even have that impetus here.
Yeah, and there's also another thing that I find deeply disturbing, that because of the Vietnam and because of how poorly the Vietnam vets were treated, which they were, the military very astutely used this to flip the switch and turn everything around and glorify everyone who serves, no matter what. They're automatically granted some sort of hero status just for serving. And as everybody knows, most soldiers are not out in combat. Most soldiers are support. Because it actually takes a lot of people and a lot of equipment to support a combat soldier. What is it like?
Logistics.
Logistically and all the rest of it. It's like 3-1, 4, 5-1 sometimes. It depends on how efficient the army is. The American army is incredibly inefficient. They have something like 4 or 5 soldiers in support for every one soldier in combat, right? And so what you have is that you have the glorification of a whole class, that they are instantly heroes, okay? And they weren't heroic, but just by using the uniform, which I think is deeply, deeply wrong. You cannot be glorifying people just because they wear a uniform. That's creating an aristocratic class. That's fucking wrong.
But it's above and beyond even the soldiers. There's political work being done there independent of that. What you're doing when you glorify the soldiers like that, it's not the soldiers you're doing it for. It's for the decision making behind what you use the soldiers for. Yeah. It provides perfect cover to say nothing I do that involves soldiers will ever be criticized, because I can turn it around and say you were criticizing the soldiers. Yeah,
exactly.
Which is not true.
Yeah,
it does not happen that way. In fact, and this was the Achilles heel. Yeah.
Yeah, because now nobody can cut the American military's budget because you're trying to strip away the tools for the soldiers to win, which is just fucking crazy. That's why, for instance, you have this boondoggle of the Joint Strike Fighter, which is just one of the most expensive pieces of equipment ever made, and a piece of equipment that does not work. It does not work and never will work for all it's supposed to do. I don't know if you don't know, the Joint Strike Fighter is I think it's like they think for the lifetime of these things it's going to be like a few $1 trillion. It's just an incredibly expensive piece of equipment that's supposed to be one plane for everything. And of course, trying to have one piece of equipment do it all, one tool that does it all, it does none well. Okay, you need specialized tools for each job. Okay. So anyway, they're trying to do this one-size-fits-all kind of thing. And if you criticize it, if you try to cut it or whatever, they say that you're trying to hamstring the American military so that it can't win the next war, which is just stupid, of course. But it's the way that people get what they want for the sake of their wallets, quite frankly. I mean, these people are just in it for the money. So look, I think that no lesson was learned from Vietnam. That seems increasingly clear, because the Second Gulf War was basically Vietnam again, but without the saving grace of having the commies as the enemy. And what happened there? It's a complete fucking mess, and nothing good came of it. And I think that there are going to be more and more wars like Vietnam, pointless wars where people are going to be needlessly sacrificed and political instability will reign, because the American empire, as the democracy that it is, it does not know how to conduct foreign policy. It simply does not. It is very good in conducting commercial foreign policy, of implementing policies that make money, but not policies that create security. On the contrary, the American empire is an empire of chaos, and it just creates chaos everywhere it goes. Somebody said this recently, some pithy sentence somewhere. Do you recall, Benway?
No, I don't actually. But what's interesting is this chaos is a manifestation, ironically enough, of lacking some of the bogeyman and accoutrement that people always accuse the right wing of fermenting, which is you're kind of kept in check when you have certain big guys who can actually threaten you in a way.
Yeah.
You stop using the army for vanity projects.
Yeah.
You
Exactly
have
right.
to use it for very specific ways. And it was always real right wingers, funny enough, rarely are interventionists.
Yeah. It's the
the
liberals. It's the liberals. Yeah. Woodrow Wilson is the father of interventionism, after all. And he was a Democrat, wasn't he?
He was.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, I think that this interventionist streak, it's becoming worse and worse. Okay. And it's all based on arrogance. I think that that's the thing I hate most about what's his face, John McCain. The arrogance of it, the arrogance of to think that just a hammer will solve all your problems. Just hit the hammer hard enough against whatever country you want, and you'll get your way. It's just arrogant and stupid.
I still think that those 6 years in the prisoner of war camp took something from him. I think it took his humanity from him, and the John McCain we get today is a manifestation of that brokenness. So
no, he was just an evil son of a bitch from the get-go.
No, I don't know, and I think he's fighting the war still. He thinks if he kills more people, he will do harm to those who imprisoned him.
That's a pointless exercise. What's interesting, though, is that all of the prisoners of war, none of their marriages survived. That's interesting. None of their previous relationships survived their imprisonment, because there were a number of people who were interviewed, people who had been prisoners of war, from the very first kid, Everett Alvarez, I think his name was.
Yep.
And
first guy captured.
Yeah, and
and a doctor whose wife Kushner's wife, who famously supported McGovern in trying to, in her mind, get her husband back. And ironically enough, they never say it explicitly in the documentary. You could tell they have very different political temperaments, this wife and the husband. And the fact that they were separated for so long, there's not a reconcilement that can happen in that situation.
Yeah. There's that famous picture, Burst of Joy, where that officer is walking across the tarmac in an airport, and you see him from behind, and you see running towards him his family, and his daughter is has her arms outstretched, which is a very, very powerful picture, right? I mean, extraordinarily powerful. And you see that happen, and of course, it hides the fact that the wife had sent him just 2 days before a Dear John letter. She'd been sleeping around with other people and found somebody else and wanted a divorce.
And that's the other piece of coming home, by the way, that it was always interesting, because the Jane Fonda, whose husband Bruce Stern is out in the war and who really is psychologically screwed up for the war, she fucks the paraplegic John Voight, who's just more physical than mentally fucked up by the war.
Yeah.
And it's funny how they play that up, and it was like Bruce Stern went out of his way to tell Hal Ashby, "Don't you dare make me the fucking villain of this story." And he had to fight to make sure that didn't happen.
Yeah.
It's interesting how these things keep popping. They did bubble up in these stories. Sorry, that's a tangent. But
No. It's very true. Okay, the North Vietnamese, how they treated these people who did commit grievous acts. I mean, come on, all those pilots shot down. What were they doing there? They were dropping bombs on the North Vietnamese. Of course, that the Vietnamese population would, beat the shit out of them, and nearly kill them. Completely understandable. Okay, unforgivable how the North Vietnamese government used them. Okay, because they knew for a fact that the North Vietnamese enemies captured, who had been processed, were treated humanely. Okay, and they knew that for a fact, and which was, of course, the case. That's not to say that a lot of times a soldier would capture somebody and wind up torturing him and shooting him, and saying, "Oh, he was an enemy combatant killed in action."
There was a famous line in the documentary of how, said, "Look, if a guy got to the back of the line, we did everything that was appropriate to treat the prisoner. We made it sure that not many people got to the
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so yeah, it's understandable, and atrocities happen in all wars, and the instinct for revenge is undeniable, and all people have it, and to pretend otherwise is just being naive. So yeah, but once they were actually in hands, I think that the treatment of those soldiers was just despicable. Okay, but that being said, I think it was really interesting how none of them they got back, and none of their relationships survived. That I found really interesting, and I wish they'd done more with that one kid that they discussed, who was ordered to be the first released, who had memorized all of the names of like 200 odd prisoners.
To Old MacDonald.
To Old MacDonald, Old MacDonald had a farm. That was really remarkable.
It's a mnemonic device is what that is, and that's how he was able to. And what's interesting is that's how they knew who was alive still.
Yeah, and how clever he was to realize instantly that he had to play stupid, and he was called the stupid one.
Exactly. It was he basically did a Claudius / Nikita Khrushchev, which is play the buffoon and you'll live longer.
Yeah, very, very clever kid, and the kid obviously must have learned Vietnamese. If he understood what they were saying about him, that's pretty remarkable. But anyway. The whole Vietnam thing, what's your summing up of this whole thing? Because we've gone on for a while, and I don't know if you want to do another episode on this, or just call it, this episode. Because I'm not sure.
Was surprising.
Go ahead.
This was surprisingly encompassing of everything I kind of wanted to hit.
Yeah.
And what was the thing that I walked away from it is not even because I certainly operate under the assumption that it was a dramatic mistake to get involved. But what I left with was a strong sense of you were fucked no matter what you did. It was like a situation from beginning to end where it was almost like, and I had mentioned this earlier, you had inherited so much responsibilities and expectations and lacked confidence in how to deal with it that there was no way this thing was ever going to lead to success, no matter what you tried to do. And that was, to me, the great tragedy of this whole situation, is that it was this fucking tar pit that no one could get out of. And the one guy who actually succeeded in pushing us out of it is considered the biggest villain of them all.
Yeah. Because for me, the biggest villain is Johnson, without question, and McNamara in almost equal measure. And I think that their responsibility just becomes, in my own mind, larger and larger with the passage of time and the realization of what was really going on. Because I recognize that my own culture sort of like blinded me to things that were going on. One of the people who blinded me the most, by the way, was Stephen King. He kept on and on harping about Nixon as the boogeyman. And I didn't realize it at the time. I just thought, he was the boogeyman. Because you read stuff like that, and you read somebody whose work you respect or admire or enjoy.
You give him the benefit of the doubt.
Sure. Yeah. And you assimilate his point of view effortlessly. And I realize now that, I was a huge Stephen King fan growing up because he's a great writer. He's not a great writer in the sense of like high literature, but he's got a lot of elements that are really good to learn from. And so if you're a young writer, if you're starting out or whatever, the energy and drive of his work is just phenomenal. But leaving that aside, the point about him is that he had this view that Nixon was the boogeyman, but he wasn't the boogeyman. He was actually the good guy, and it's led to a much more sophisticated view as to what was going on. How the culture, the left-wing culture, the cultural gatekeepers needed to inflict all of the blame on Nixon, needed him to be the bad guy and to be the sacrificial lamb, the scapegoat, literally, for all of the sins of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, because they're the ones who did it. You could argue that Eisenhower had played a role, but it was really Kennedy and Johnson's war. That administration, because that administration continued,
So in your eyes, Nixon becomes a little bit of a Jesus figure.
A little bit.
He bears the sins of all America in order to save it.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, I had to note it
No,
in
I'm
those
thinking
terms.
more along the Jewish notion of the scapegoat, of designated. Okay, that goat is going to bear all of the sins of the tribe, and we're going to take it out there and kill it. Okay, that kind of thing. And I think that Watergate was inevitable. That there was this psychodrama of people who wanted him to pay, not for what he had done, which is really trivial. I mean, you look at the whole Watergate thing; it's fundamentally a trivial problem compared to any of the things that Johnson did or Kennedy did. Trivial. I mean, come on. You think that if it had come out that Kennedy had ordered the assassination of a foreign head of state, you think that if that had come out, there wouldn't have been impeachment proceedings? Fucking A, there would have been, because it was fucking immoral. And the time in 1963 when that happened, that comes out, and the moral vision that the United States had for itself and what the people thought, you think that he would have made it through the 64 election? He would have been impeached because it was fucking evil. It went beyond just being politically pragmatic, okay? This was directly caused the death of a foreign leader, knowing that it was going to happen, okay?
It's hard. Well, here's the thing. I don't know, because part of the argument being made was that we were going to ignore things that the other fellas did, and we certainly have had a long history of across many administrations of doing exactly what Kennedy kind of did. I don't know. Do I think he gets a free pass a lot of ways? Yeah, I think he does. I don't know the degree to which, if we had known, we would have accepted it or not.
You know what happens?
You
know what happens to me about Kennedy? Why I despise him more and more. It's because of this girl that came out a few years ago. What's her name? There's I'll look it up while we're talking. This girl, okay, I forget her name. I'm going to look it up in just a minute, but let me just tell the story first. She was a 19-year-old intern. She was like a good family, right? Blonde, young, stupid, of course, because every 19-year-old of either sex is an idiot. But she was very attractive, sexually attractive. And so Kennedy took her on as his mistress. And there's a story that he, in the White House pool, got her to give one of his buddies a blowjob in front of him while he watched, which I find that really despicable. I mean, I find that truly, especially as a father, I find that despicable, just fucking horrible, because he's a 40-something-year-old man. He's a grown man. He knows what's what. Okay, old enough to be this poor girl's father. He's the president of the United States. I mean, I'm not even talking about the Me Too sexual harassment shit. I mean, just an issue of just decency, okay? Do you think that Truman or Eisenhower or even fucking FDR, who had a couple of side pieces, do you think that they would have, in their right minds, ever would have done such a thing? No. I mean, FDR, he liked his women, he liked his cocktails. Do you think that he would have cajoled some poor girl into giving... I don't know, Harry Hopkins a blowjob while at the White House pool while he was swimming about and watching? No, that wouldn't have happened. Kennedy was a fucking piece of shit, okay, on a moral level, okay, as a man, I cannot respect such an individual. I cannot even call him properly a man. And I know that I'm going on and on about this, but that incident is just, oh man, it just... I am inarticulate because of my rage over that.
Well, here's the thing, as I said, with Kennedy and to a lesser extent Johnson, but it's there. There were expectations that and this is why, to your question, what if Eisenhower or not Eisenhower, if FDR had done these things, the thing is, there was an expectation throughout their period up until Johnson was that we wouldn't ask those questions because there's this implicit purity to this role, these guys who occupy it. What what hitherto kind of happened is through Johnson and Nixon, people lost that ability to just accept that these guys did nothing, or there's a purity to the office that that is untouchable, and they couldn't conceivably have done these things. The truth of the matter is that the rot started much earlier, and Kennedy bears a lot of that responsibility, independent of whether he got a blowjob from some bitch. It's the Kennedy's looseness with everything, and the idea that, to your point, because he came from a good family, he was good looking, he had a book that people liked, he got a free pass.
Not even written by him, by the way. It was written
not
by
even
Teddy
written by
Sorensen.
him. Yeah. The reason it bothers me is because I see a lot of that Kennedy, giving them a pass to two other presidents I despise, which is Clinton, who idolized Kennedy, and Obama, who more or less outside of the fucking is pretty much the same Kennedy situation.
It'll come out soon enough that Obama's gay. He's going to come out, and everybody's going to say, "Oh, he's so brave to come out loud and proud." Obama's gay. You just wait; it'll come out. That I have no doubt whatsoever. Look, by the way, the name of the young woman is Mimi Alford. Okay, if you're interested, go check out the stuff, because it came out in 2012, and people have been remarkably quiet about it since that issue came out. And I think that it would be good to talk about Mimi Alford and the Me Too movement. And Benway, actually, now that we're on the air, as it were, I'd like to throw the gauntlet down that we have a conversation about Mimi Alford and the Me Too movement and that whole piece of shit movement, which is so fucking hypocritical on the part of the left, that they fling shit at some people, but not at other people. Not at St. John, they don't say a fucking thing about that fucker who did fucking awful things. Mimi Alford is the key. But anyway, I lost the train of thought.
If you want me to talk about the Kennedys fucking women and doing a lot more than fucking women, I'm more than game for that.
Yeah. No, the hypocrisy. Okay.
That's the nature. That's the Kennedy family. I mean, it goes with the territory.
Yeah, those fuckers, I hate them, because first of all, okay, on a personal level, I find them déclassés. I find them just they're nouveau riche, and the only one whom I respect is Joe Kennedy, because he was a guy with balls, and he went out and made a lot of money and fucked a lot of girls and just had a good old fucking time, and good on him. I respect the son of a bitch like that, because he earned the thing. What he had was his. He earned it. He won it. He had the brains and the balls and the good luck to get his way. Good on him, okay? His sons, they're all pieces of shit. Robert Kennedy was a horrible, horrible individual. I mean, apart from the fact that he appointed racist judges and talked about civil rights, right? Which is just so much bullshit, right? The guy was just a piece of shit on so many grounds, right? And they were so fucking arrogant. Okay, I'm not going to go into a Kennedy rant because I could go on for fucking hours. Okay.
Well, with that little preview taste, maybe this is a time to say, it's a good wrap up point. In addition to Vietnam, we got angry with the Kennedy hot under the collar. So on that note, thanks everybody for listening. Yeah. This wonderful discussion on Vietnam.
No, wait, hang on. We've gone almost 2 hours, so let's just tidy up. I'm all about tidying up, and I want to ask you, do you think that the lessons of Vietnam are obvious? Okay, get in it to win it. Don't go half-assed and shit. Right? Do you think that the lessons of Vietnam have been learned, or not really?
They lasted about 5 minutes and then were forgotten.
I think that the only time that the lessons of Vietnam were truly and well applied was in the first Gulf War.
That was 5 minutes. That's my 5 minutes.
Yeah, that was the 5 minutes, because everybody who was in leadership positions in the first Gulf War was Vietnam vet, and they all had the same thing: go in, go out, and know exactly what you're doing. Don't go and break shit just for the sake of breaking it. Just because they left Saddam Hussein's army more or less intact. Okay, I mean, they owned the skies over Iraq for the rest of Saddam Hussein's the time they was in power, but they didn't go and destroy the country, Iraq. I mean, okay, they were smart enough to realize we're here to liberate Kuwait. It's because of the oil. Fuck everything else, and we're not going to bother with anybody else. Perfect. Yeah, but aside from that, no.
Well, like I said, because and the funny thing was those who least learned the lessons were the generation that in theory should have learned the lessons. Namely, it's the baby boomers of the 90s and 2000s who exhibited the least awareness of it. Funny, they spent too much time protesting it and not enough time studying it.
Yeah. Okay, so you're right. Let's call it a day. I'll let you. I interrupted you as you were taking us out, and I guess that the point I was trying to make was actually it's depressingly small, because you would think that there were a lot of lessons learned out of Vietnam, but no fucking lesson was learned. That's the sad part of this whole situation. It was a pointless waste of life of young people who had so much promise and so much possibility. They were all thrown away like fucking confetti. For what? For nothing. And both sides, by the way. But okay. I'm getting upset. So you take us out, Benway.
Ladies and gentlemen, this was another episode of the Coach and Benway podcast. Despite the sad exit discussion, I think it was a rich conversation. Hope to have you again, and especially when we get into Kennedy fucking.
Yeah, see you all soon. Take care.
Bye.